4, 3, 2, 1.
Wow! How'd you do that?
Angular momentum.
What is that?
Well,
first we're going to be talking about angular velocity.
Angular velocity. The definition of angular velocity is simply the rate of change of the angular position of a rotating object or body. Angular velocity is a vector having its angular speed component accompanied by either of two defined directions or senses. Now, the vector is proportional to the angular speed. The direction of the angular velocity vector is perpendicular to the plane where the rotation occurs.
now we're going to talk about moment of inertia.
What is moment of inertia? Moment of inertia is a specific rotation around an axis. It involves the distribution of masses around varying distances from an axis of rotation. It depends on the mass, but also the location of the mass in relation to the rotation. For example, the closer the mass is to the point of rotation, then the faster the rotation will be, and this also affects angular velocity. A point mass of moment of inertia is the product of mass times the distance from the axis squared. Moment of inertia is related to Newton's second law and how force equals mass times acceleration. Now we're going to talk about angular momentum.
Angular momentum is a vector quantity that represents the product of a body's moment of inertia. Angular momentum is held constant through motion. To generate angular momentum, you have to apply force onto the ground so that the ground can apply force back onto you. For example, divers generate angular momentum by jumping up off of the diving board and applying the ground reaction force, and when they come down and jump back onto the diving board, they have a contact force. Another important factor when generating angular momentum is moment of inertia. The larger an object's moment of inertia is, the more angular momentum it has. For example, when a diver pulls their legs closer to the center of rotation, their moment of inertia decreases and their angular velocity increases. Sometimes when generating angular momentum, there is a trade-off between angular velocity and moment of inertia. To continue with the diving example, when a diver has a tighter tuck, they have a smaller moment of inertia, resulting in a larger angular velocity.
And now, let's discuss the math.
The equation for angular momentum is L is equal to I omega. The L stands for angular momentum, the I stands for moment of inertia, and the omega stands for angular velocity. As the law of conservation of angular momentum states, throughout a motion of a body or an object, the angular momentum will always remain constant. Therefore, we know that angular velocity and moment of inertia must have an inverse relationship in order to keep the angular momentum constant. If during that motion the angular velocity is increased, then the moment of inertia must decrease. Or if the moment of inertia is increased, then the angular velocity must decrease. If you have ever been on one of these, you know about angular momentum. When trying to stop the merry-go-round from moving, it will be much harder when there is a higher value for angular momentum. You know that it is much harder to stop when it is moving at a faster rate. This is because of a greater angular velocity that will result in a greater angular momentum. You can also know that the more weight you have on the merry-go-round, it will be harder to stop. The more weight that you have further away from the center of the merry-go-round, it will be even harder. That is all because of angular momentum is greater because of the higher value for the moment of inertia. The higher the values for both the angular velocity and moment of inertia results in a higher value for angular momentum throughout the entire motion.
Now for some examples!
For my flips, both forward and backward, I keep my limbs close to my body to make it easier and not take as much effort. But what would happen if I had straightened my legs during the whole flip? I would need a larger bounce or force to build up my angular momentum to get around the axis of rotation. Why would I need more force? Because my mass is dispersed out at each end of my body, and instead of my mass being in all one area, it's spread out and takes more effort for each end to rotate around the axis. By shrinking my moment of inertia, I am able to speed up my velocity during both of my flips. In my dive, instead of angular momentum being used in this video, my dive includes of linear momentum. The difference is, I'm not rotating around an axis. Instead, I'm keeping in a straight line. That's also why the moment of inertia doesn't play a big part in linear momentum.
And one more example.
In gymnastics, this trick is called a giant. The bar is the center of rotation. You could find the moment of inertia for each part of my body by measuring its distance from the bar, squaring it, and adding it to my mass. You could also find the angular velocity by how many giants or how many radians by body turns around the bar per second. Once both moment of inertia and angular velocity have been found, then you can multiply them together to find my angular momentum.
Hey guys, so now we're going to give you a little recap of the video. So remember, today we taught you about angular velocity, angular momentum, and moment of inertia. Then from there, we explained to you the math and the reasoning behind it. Then we gave you a video and some examples of it, and we explained them pretty thoroughly. So my challenge to you is to go calculate each one of these and show us what you got. Thanks for watching. Woo!
Cause this is it. The beat that I'm banging is delicious.
Burgerlicious definition make them boys go loco. They want my treasures so they get their pleasures from my